Have you ever noticed how kids talk about films in terms of goodies and baddies? It's not as stupid as it sounds, it's actually a very structured way of thinking. Let me show you how it works. In Back to the Future, if Doc and Marty are both the goodies, then the baddie is...
Go ahead, kid! Jump!
obviously Biff.
The suicide will be nice and neat.
If you think goodies in Star Wars, and baddies...
But you are not a Jedi yet.
Claude Levi-Strauss noticed this kind of contrast in all stories, and it's his structural work that we're going to be looking at today. As always, if you're new here and you're a student of film or media, I recommend you subscribe to keep up with all my latest videos, and if you learn anything from this one, I'd really appreciate if you left a like. So, Claude Levi-Strauss was a structuralist thinker, which means he looked for patterns or rules in things to work out how they worked, a little bit like a rule book. So when he looked at myths and legends going all the way back to the Greeks to try and find out what they had in common and how they worked, he found that they all had something in common. At their heart, they all contained conflict between two sides, binary oppositions. Themes that represented polarizing ideas and ideologies, good and bad. Light and dark, order and chaos. You get the picture, the stuff that makes for great storytelling. Now, I don't want you to take this totally literally, like James Bond is the story of conflict between the British government and whatever foreign threat he's after. You need to think more thematically. So Bond might represent order, law, security, and the threat is actually chaos, terrorism, anarchy.
Well, I think I will call you on that one.
Many of these oppositions are used so commonly, and you're probably familiar with them, they become cliché. So in sci-fi, we have man versus machine, a conflict that warns of the dangers of our reliance on technology. Or maybe human versus aliens, and it's reminded that no matter where we're from, we're all human at the end of the day. In romance, we most commonly have monogamy versus adultery.
Oh my God, she was there. She was still there. She was in there when I was in there. Oh, just.
And if we look at crime, we have law versus chaos, cheating versus honesty. Political dramas obviously brings the left versus the right, but very often themes such as corruption versus purity or war versus peace.
I'm saying that when the president does it, that means it's not illegal.
I'm sorry?
That's what I believe.
These are just a few of the binary oppositions you're going to find in certain genres, but in each case, one side has to prevail. Now, something we already know from Todorov's narratology theory is whenever there's conflict or disruption, we need to have resolution. Check out up here if you haven't seen that video yet. So in the case of binary oppositions, which side should win? This is a bigger question than you might think because whichever side wins and what they represent might be being portrayed as the correct option. Let's look back at our examples from earlier. I think it's safe to say most people would say monogamy and being faithful to your partner is the right thing to do. Well, this is exactly how we see conflict of being faithful versus unfaithful played out in countless rom-coms. We're usually spared the tragedy of a bitter breakup after one character is unfaithful, but not before we find out just how devastating things would have been had they actually been unfaithful.
Don't do that.
Yep. We see that if you're unfaithful, you will end up with pain, or if you are faithful, then you'll live happily ever after. Another interesting way that you might want to see binary oppositions representing ideologies is in the film Free Guy. On the surface, this is just a simple story of a character who is trying to break free from his programming and become independent. On the one side, you have the non-player characters who all want freedom but are oppressed, and on the other side you have the antagonist, Antoine, who wants absolute control over what they do. Could it be, if we apply binary opposition and see these as themes, that this represents democracy versus communism?
Buddy, if we're not real, doesn't that mean that nothing you do matters?
I know this might be a stretch, but ideologically, it's interesting that the person who wants absolute power is ultimately defeated, and freedom, democracy, prevails. So, Strauss's work on binary opposition is actually quite simple. Narratives contain themes which conflict with each other, and the way that they're resolved might suggest ideology. But how do we as an audience identify binary opposites? In film, there are very often stylistic clues that act as signposts to them. Let's take the Force in Star Wars, Jedi versus Sith, or good versus evil. We see this in oppositional costumes, colors, lighting. Even the camera work looks different. Stylistically, this is showing us two oppositional forces. Essentially, it comes down to this. If you're analysing film, where can you see the most polarising characters? What do they represent? What are their motives? Who wins and what does that say about society? Or to put it even more simply, who are the goodies and who are the baddies? That's all for today, guys. As always, thank you very much for watching. If you've learned anything, if you've made it to this point, I'd really appreciate it if you left a like. And if you're looking for where to go next, I'd recommend checking out that video on narratology I mentioned earlier, or you might want to brush up on your camera shots in preparation for your next analysis. Thanks as always, and I'll see you next time.